So just a heads up, I recorded this gameplay when I had a cold, so it's not exactly me at the height of my ability, and it is on heroic because, yes, I am a pussy and I don't play on legendary most of the time. So, as the Halo community is eagerly anticipating the announcement of the next Halo game, it has been speculated that the return of the Flood for the Halo franchise could be in store for us. So, basically, there's been some debate as to whether this is a good thing for Halo or a not so good direction for the franchise. So, I think that to fully understand this, I need to just discuss my personal biases regarding the Flood, as they are a semi-controversial topic in Halo. So for me, the Flood are kind of somewhere in between what most people regard them. You have the people on normally extremes, some saying that it's not true Halo without the Flood made Halo special. Other people saying they're the worst enemy in any video game of all time, and I feel like they're kind of somewhere in between, as I kind of feel like from a narrative perspective they did a great job as being that villain, that thing that you have to save humanity from. They drove the tension and the conflict of the Halo narrative. Also, from an atmospheric perspective, I mean, they really knocked it out of the park. They enabled Bungie to do things that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to do. You look at levels like 343 Guilty Spark. I mean, look no further. That mission, among some others, really had that great atmosphere that kind of added slight horror elements almost into the game. With that being said, though, from a gameplay perspective, again, I'm kind of mixed. On one hand, they are extremely simplistic. I mean, it's basically pass the shotgun, pass the sword, let me just go to town on these guys. But at the same time, I do feel like they are interesting in the way that they are basically an exact opposite of the Covenant, where the Covenant, you have to use strategy, you have to think, you have to think about the weapons and your maneuvering, and it's a slower fight, even if it can be fast paced, but it's a more methodical, a more strategy game. Whereas the Flood, it's a lot more reflexes, it's a lot more that how fast can I move, how fast can I fire and switch, and you're always thinking on your feet and having to move very quickly. Now, this is obviously what some people dislike, but with that being said, I think if used correctly, they did add some gameplay, advantages, just as something that could be used as kind of a change of pace from the Covenant. With that being said, however, as I do seem to be a little more Flood positive than most people, with that being said, I do think that adding the Flood back into Halo 6, into the Flood, into the Halo storyline is just not a good idea. And I think to understand why I feel this way, I'm going to compare it to a couple other franchises, and I think Star Wars is a really important one here, as it's going through a very similar problem to what I fear would happen if the Flood returned in Halo 6, and that is the fact that you don't accomplish anything. It creates this circle when you're fighting the same enemy over and over. If you look at Star Wars, with where we're going here in the sequel trilogy, it feels like the original trilogy, but like nothing happened from the original trilogy to now. What was the point, right, of everything our heroes went through and accomplished in the original trilogy back in the day when there were 6 episodes or 3 episodes, depending how old you are? That was the end. We triumphed over evil, and that was what made that series so good. And now it feels like we should be on top. And I get it, the Empire, but it's like 30 years after the Empire was collapsing, in quotations. It should, even if the Empire's still around or there's a new evil or anything, but we're looking at it and it feels like nothing's changed. We're still the ragtag team of rebels, that are scrounging up for supplies and resources over the technological giant that is the Empire. And that's frustrating because it feels like we haven't done anything. The point of stories is conflict and overcoming conflict, whether it be internal, external, whatever. So when you're always fighting the same enemy every time, you never get anywhere. And we're seeing that with Star Wars, where it feels almost silly. It's like, all right, we've been here. We were the ragtag team of rebels. We came over that. Say what you will about the prequels. The prequels had a unique story. The prequels didn't have the same enemies. It didn't feel like the same situation. The world changed. It morphed. Sometimes a little too much. But it did create this idea that, it makes sense. It's 20 years difference. It wouldn't make sense for, if the ragtag team of rebels overcame the Empire, it doesn't make sense that we're still fighting the Empire 30 years later. And I know it's the First Order. Don't tell me that. It's the Empire, it really is. So I just kind of fear that happening to Halo if we're constantly fighting the Flood. If the Flood is just, you know what I mean? We overcame that challenge. We did it. Halo 3 was great. Looking at another area that Halo succeeded in the past, but has kind of diminished afterwards. I mean, look at Halo 4 to 5. Yes, Halo 4 is controversial, but one of the things I think that is less controversial about it, I mean, even if some people thought the story was too, deep and sad and messed with the characters too much, I mean, losing Cortana was great. I mean, not great, but it was so well executed. It was painful. It was a beautiful storyline. I mean, the scene where you lose Cortana is phenomenal, don't get me wrong, but the scene after, with Lasky on the bridge, I mean, to me, that's one of Halo's greatest triumphs across all the games. That moment is special to me, and I think it's a great moment for gaming as a whole. But then you look at Halo 5 and what Brian Reed did, and no, it doesn't necessarily detract from Halo 4. We still have Halo 4 untouched, but it does detract. It's this idea that, a game serves two purposes, one as its own standalone product and one in a narrative and a story with the rest. It has to do both. And now Halo 4, in terms of its narrative with the rest, is diminished. It's still great as a standalone story, but knowing that Cortana comes back and tries to conquer the world because she's evil and she needs world domination, it's silly, it's dumb. It takes what was a great story. Well, we didn't lose Cortana. She's back now. And I think we all know where the story's going. Probably will, she'll realize her flaws in the end and her mistaken ways. We'll get her back. I think a franchise that you can look at that did a really good job at realizing this. Now, it was a long time, it came from a different time when the people that own these franchises weren't, executives in suits and ties, sitting there just looking at, the money and trying to decide based on money. But if you look at Lord of the Rings and what Tolkien did, I mean, he, if you don't know the story, from my understanding, he thought about making a Lord of the Rings sequel series books, based on Aragorn's son, where Sauron came back, and Aragorn's son had to stop Sauron from taking over the world again. And, he was like, well, wait a second, I achieved something great. I have a great story. Why would I risk diminishing that? Having them fight for the fate of the world again. We did it. We fought that battle. It doesn't make sense to try to retell that story because there isn't enough to gain, and I risk losing everything and losing this story I made that is now beloved. And I think, to me, that is the most important thing. The original Halo trilogy is special. It is the greatest gaming trilogy of all time, to many, to me. I think it's a phenomenal game trilogy, and it stands as such, and leave that as the Flood trilogy. Video games are about overcoming challenges in gameplay, but also narratively, and we've overcome the Flood. I know, yes, they're still around, and technically, narratively, canonically in the franchise, they could come back, and it would, make sense to have the return of the Flood from that perspective. But at the same time, I think to myself that you only stand to just going back and playing the original trilogy. It will feel hollow. It will feel not special when, you do that final Warthog run, and, you land on, and, you watch that Halo ring blow up, and it's all over, and, you stop the Flood. It just, you risk losing all of that. And to me, there could be a lot to gain by the Flood coming back. Don't get me wrong. I think, in fact, there's a lot to gain. It could really be that return to Halo, that Halo feel. 343 could play with the horror elements there. It could be nice to have a acceptable second enemy, in my opinion, where the Prometheans are just atrocious. And I think that's why we're having this conversation. If the Prometheans were interesting narratively or gameplay-wise, or preferably both, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because we'd have the direction. And I think that's why, because 343 couldn't nail the Prometheans in 2 games. I mean, they're atrocious. They're a chore to fight against. I don't think anybody cares about them or fears them. So what are we talking about? You know what I mean? We need something other than the Covenant. And speaking of the Covenant, I think, again, you see Halo going down that path of just, constant fighting. After Halo 3, it felt like the Covenant was over. In terms of Covenant, after Halo 3, you assume that we beat them. Right? After Halo 3, it's assumed that we beat the Flood. It's assumed we triumphed. Either we destroyed them or they joined us, depending on, what piece of the Covenant, what race we're discussing. But then, you wake up from Halo 4 and it's like, we need a half-decent enemy for them to fight against. They can't fight against the Prometheans the whole game. So you just randomly fight against Covenant, throughout half the game, and God bless them for doing it too, because I can't imagine playing through Halo 4 with just Prometheans. That would be, I'm going mentally insane thinking about it. But, it just doesn't really make sense. And yeah, you can say, well, there was, Covenant Civil War, and different, Jul 'Mdama. But in the end, I mean, they're just doing that. They wrote that in to cover their tracks. If this was film or a different genre, they probably wouldn't have done that. But you need that enemy to fight against, so they're like, we're still fighting the Covenant, and we're gonna fight the Covenant forever in Halo. I mean, we're not getting out of that. So I think, that's it. So obviously, I'd prefer the Flood to not return, even though I do see some potential there. I think it's a slippery slope, and something I'd prefer 343 to stay away from. However, I'm curious to know what you guys think of the Flood returning. Whether you think you're excited for it, because let's just be honest, it's happening. I think it's definitely happening after Halo 5's ending, and after the Halo Wars 2 DLC. It's going to happen. So I'm curious to see whether you guys are excited for this or not so excited for this, and I'll catch you guys later.